Thanks, Cuong. Folks have any questions, please raise your hand. Feel free to drop them in the chat. I had a couple of questions. I have a couple of questions. So looking back on your slide about the PPL survey, I guess a question, and if you know the answer, it'd be great. Was there a particular reason why PPL was, I'll say, focused on 2030.5 to see where people were in relation to 2030.5?
Yes. So actually, the person that did the survey, he run a test lab for PPL on DER resources. And I think the equipment, existing test set that they have in the lab is 2035. They have a lot more 2030.5 equipment. So I think they went into it with these, lens that, okay, I have this installed base or whatnot, right? I have capability. Let's see what is being supported in the industry based on that. So, for DER, they're already testing DER for 2030.5 in general, right? So inverter. But now they wanted to shift gear to EVSE. So that's the lens. But the interesting thing is that their back office is a DNP3 shop, right? So there is an integration as well there. So then their utility automation part of it, or substation automation, I would clarify, is DNP3. So, you can see that there's a lot of standard in play, but that's why the focus is there, Chris.
Okay. Then in thinking of, so we've been talking a lot about, before I move on to that, in your discussion around your use cases and the messaging, you're focused on demand-side management. Is your use case, is that at a high level where, it's sort of all it needs underneath it is a charging infrastructure to send a message, or is it limited by particular applications like for fleets or for level 2 or for level 3? And so how do you sort of address that level of that use case?
So, because we're doing it based on a technology approach, right, application approach, we don't go into that level of detail yet. I think the profile would have to touch on that. So the use case, what it trying to capture is that, okay, so for instance, if you have level 2 charger, right, what you need to send, and then what information you need from the EV. So like we're trying to look at what all of those entities need, right, and then roll it up to a messaging exchange pattern, right? Then capture that as a requirement. We don't go, directly now. Okay. Now if you look at that, then how would you implement it, right? That's where the profile will come in.
So in other words, by setting it at the stage you are and having the options to participate, it doesn't matter necessarily what type of EVSE infrastructure is underneath it, because if something can respond, it can respond.
Right. As long as you can provide whatever data or message that we need to do a function, right? So that's the key, right? If you can provide that, and if you can actually, receive and control, then you can do it, right? So we don't go into like actually selecting that part. We just want to capture what you want to do and how you would do it.
Super. Again, let's see, let me check if you have any questions here on chat. Nothing yet. If folks have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box, raise your hand, flip on your camera. Let me just scoot through here real fast. So in thinking about developing your use cases, let me go back. So in developing the profile, I guess a thing that people might be concerned about in thinking about having how a utility would develop a profile is making sure that, so in Connecticut, for example, there's 2 main utilities. How has the relationship between the utilities in the development of these profiles, these use cases, been going? Are there, how have you had to deal with potential, utility A says, no, we want this, utility B says, we want this. So how has your process tried to overcome that level of, that type of conversation? Because again, what I'm trying to contemplate here is, there's two utilities here in Connecticut. The PURA has asked them to, at least my understanding of the order, to work together to develop some RFP requirements. So how have utilities come together to get through some of their differences, and what might be some of the differences that a utility would have?
Yeah, so actually, that's part of the landscape analysis that we've done and the stakeholder engagement. So for the use case, we don't actually limit the functional requirement, right? What we want to do is just talk to utility A, utility B, utility C, and down the list, and just get what they actually want to do, right? So the way that the use case is architected right now, most of the ask is actually accommodated. So it's not that we can't accommodate. So that's kind of like the optionality that I kind of told you about is, you wanted to give, all of the potential, right? So it's just the potential functional requirement or control, right? So a lot of it is actually coordination and control, right? That's pretty much what it is, we want to capture everything that, or as much as possible based on our stakeholder pool of what they want to do. Right. So we architected the use case based on that it addresses at least all of the things that we have gotten back from our utility partner that they want to do. Right. So for the most part, and I think that kind of lead into the focus on this man-side management, because I think for the utility that we work with, that's been mainly what they wanted to do, which is actually to manage. And then also for the fleet owner too, right? They also want to, because demand charge is a huge thing, right? So the other thing that I forgot to mention is that the use case right now is very much business agnostic, right? We don't deal with the business yet, right? Because we just want to provide the capability or capture the requirement of whatever operation, or not whatever, but the current state of operation that people want to do, and provide the communication and data needed to actually do that through the interfaces, right? So that's our overarching goal to do it. So then, because for utility, they want to have the management for the demand. That has been kind of their focus on for their ask, so to speak.
So you mentioned. So the notes I've been taking, I'm sort of shorthanding what I think you're saying. Is there a process by which you can determine the outcomes? So in other words, in this working group, the utilities or the participants in the use case, the outcome they wanted to focus on was demand side management and figure that out. Is there a way that you've seen or would recommend around how to have that conversation around determining the outcomes, or what goes into determination of outcomes? Because again, what I think I'm capturing from your presentation in the development of this use case is you have up front what is an entity capable of doing, and then on the other side you have what are the outcomes that the entity wants to achieve. Is that so? How are the functionalities captured, and how are the outcomes captured?
So I think a lot of that would actually be in the business case part of this, right? Because, and then I think we're going to have to address some of that when we actually do the profile, because once you narrow down the function and the option and stuff like that, you're going to have to tackle that. But I think what we want to do ultimately are to establish some performance requirement, right, for these. So like if you want to, have some kind of event for the demand side management or whatnot, like what, like what kind of latency do you expect, right? What kind of, reaction do you need to get? And then how can you actually, ensure all of that? So I think that's the outcome part. I mean, if I interpret it correctly, Chris, that we would want. Because I think that's part of the validation too, right? So I think, through this development, once we have a profile, what we intend to do is to partner with some kind of system operator along with a utility and trying to test it out, right? Okay, so this is, what we want you to use, to actually do this, fleet managed charging, right? and then, have your little fleet, and then, have your management, and you kind of run through it, right? And see if you can actually achieve, what the goal, which is to manage your demand, right? And so then that's what we need to prove out. So that would be the second piece of the work, Chris, is actually proving it out. Because, I mean, a lot of time right now we're doing, standard work is pretty much documentary, right? We're doing it on paper, right? Be nice chart and stuff like that, right? But we need to actually have the proving out. So, so the utility, so I think that's one of the lens that we go through is, once we have this completed, we need to, find a utility partner and a fleet operator to kind of, have a demonstration around it. I think that would be the, like I mentioned before, the proof of concept, and I think we need to take it all the way down to that implementation phase.
Okay. Do folks have, I can keep peppering through with questions. I have plenty of them to finish our next 12 minutes here. Do folks have any questions that they would like to add? Because, certainly I cannot represent everyone's interests in these questions and answers, or these questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to, raise your hand, flip on your camera, or drop them in the chat, and we'll get to them. While people are still formulating. So performance requirements, that's something that we did talk a little bit about in a previous meeting here in the context of metrics. Where have you guys, has any work been done in your working group around the type of metrics or performance requirements the utility or whoever it is would want to measure to show that, it's working, that the profile is working, that the response rate is what you would anticipate it to be, that the opt-out rate is what the opt-out rate is, or what have you? How has the development of those requirements or metrics been coming in the working group?
So I think that's also kind of related back to the business case a little bit. And I think SEPA has a different arm that is working on the business case for EV and EV charging. So I think we're going to have to interact with them. The performance requirement that I alluded to earlier on is more on the technology, right? So if you pick a protocol, and so the protocol, there's two things. So let me unpack a little bit. So you pick a protocol that is a communication protocol. There's also a physical, communication that you have to deal with, right? Either Wi-Fi, radio, cellular, all that stuff, right? So from the technology standpoint, what we want to do is at least to characterize, the performance of that protocol based on, whatever you use, and can you actually use that to implement, this set? Like, okay, so if you have an event, you need a 5-minute response, you need a minute response, you need a second response. So we're looking at that more for the performance of the devices and the actual network system, not so much on what they, how much participation rate and stuff like that. I think that's more the business case that we have to deal with. But it's also very useful, right? Because we want to have a solution or an application that is more palatable for people, right? So the sign-up rate and the things like that is really important. But I think for now, to the standard development or profile development part, we're looking at it more from the technology performance and not quite the business performance yet. But I think that's okay. A really important thing. I think we're gonna have to push that because, for adoption, right? That's really important for adoption. Because, if we roll this out and nobody really participates, then it's going to be a dud, right? So, so I think that's something that we'll have to consider actually, and then the demonstration would be, hopefully give us a little insight in that, to see how, and then, you saw as far as TE and, different demand response program, right? There's some metrics around that. So we'll have to kind of figure that in as well.
Okay. For the working group, that's been working on this. How many utilities have been participating in it, and have any of the utilities? I know you talked about you're looking for a partner to test this out, but just curious. So how many utilities have been working on the development of this profile in the working group, and are there any initial takeaways from those utilities, without naming any who they are, around implementation or application of some of these organizational pieces of this use case?
Right. So we do have quite a few, but we have two that are mainly active. So for any kind of standard work, right? You have 80-20 rule, right? Say I have 80 on the list, but only 20 actually, are active and do the work. So for the two that we have actively participating, they're more worried about, how they're going to manage this as a new load. So not really thinking about actual, business case. So that's why I kind of stress the business case quite a bit, because we don't have a lot of that perspective, at least in the working group, right? It's more technology focused. And then for the utility that are participating, it's kind of like, okay, I'm gonna have these load coming on. How am I gonna deal with it, right, in my system? So for them, it's pretty much reliability and resiliency focus, more or less, for the system. And I think that's kind of the lens that they bring to the table. So it's a lot of focus has been on that. And then, for them, it's like they, I think at least for the two, they don't plan to actually operate in the fleet by themselves at the moment. There are some utilities that are, thinking about actually being an operator too. That's, like actually operate a chart depot and stuff like that. So there are some utilities that are thinking about that. But then for the one that are active, the two that we have, they're not at that, level yet. So I think, one thing that we wanted to work through SEPA and their membership is that, once we have this use case finalized, we want to go back out, right, to kind of do some more information gathering and engagement with their stakeholder to see, okay, now you have this, right? How can you actually take advantage of this? Or there any appetite for you to, to take, more an active role on this rather than just reactive role, right? Because the two that we have right now are more reactive.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it still kind of is a new world to some extent, where there still is a lot of work to be done to enable greater utilization of EVs and EVSEs into utility operations. And so it's expected, I guess, to an extent that those utilities would be in reactive mode as opposed to, figuring out how to use these as means to which integrate and use rather than just respond and react. And so I had another question around the use case. So there were 4 applications or 3 applications of the use case: the utility to charging system operator, utility aggregator who then communicates with charging system operator, and the third one was, I guess, a combination of the two. Do you have a sense of which one, if you can or want to, which one is likely going to be more prevalent across the industry based on what you've been talking about? I ask because, again, the Connecticut EDCs have been asked by the PURA to go out and do an RFP for in response to the PURA order. And thinking about how the utility might be implementing that, I'm just kind of curious, is there one of those 3 that perhaps is more likely to show up sooner compared to the other 2? Which may help us determine which type of use case should be prioritized in the short term.
Okay, so I need to preface this a little bit, right? So this is my own opinion, and it is just based on what I, be able to gather from, my interaction in the field. But so what I have seen so far through the interaction is the number 2, right? So it's the DSO to an aggregator to a charge system operator. It seemed like that been more prevalent, but the caveat to that is more prevalent for bigger fleet, right? So we talk about buses and delivery vehicle and stuff like that, or even large vehicle, right? So the reason is that those things are really big load, right? So people are more concerned about that, and there's actually more potential for it, right? So what we have seen in those cases is that there is a operator in between, like an aggregator or operator in between, that kind of acts at a they kind of control the business case, right, for the owner and then for the utility too, right? And I think it's still focused pretty much on demand side management though, not beyond that yet. Even though some of them are trying to build these bus depot into a microgrid, right? So I think in the future there could be a lot of ancillary services and grid services that are enabled, and EV would be a part, right? Only not the whole thing, but a part of that, services beyond that, because I think they have to build in battery and things like that, and other genset, in that, bus depot. So if you look at that big kind of, fleet, big fleet, high demand. So then that the second use case is what we've seen the most. And I think for the first one is pretty much what our utility participant has kind of looked at, because that's more or less their reactionary thing. And then so that, I think that would be the second one that I would think would be more prevalent, because that's just something that I have to deal with, and let's deal with it, right? And so that scenario kind of gives you that flexibility or gives you that capability. The third one is a little more complicated, because I think that kind of introduced the whole transactive energy and pricing and event into it, right? So I think that one would be a little harder to unpack, I think. Is that what you're going after, Chris?
Yep. Yeah, you said magic words, transactive energy. So that's all I focus on. So we have time for one more question. So I do want to give the audience here a chance to ask a question, because, like I said, I have particular interest in questions here, but I do want to hear from the folks here on the line. Anybody have a question here for Cuong before we move on to our next session? I'm still not seeing anything. Either I'm asking really good questions that everyone wants to ask, or Cuong has answered everyone's questions already. So I'm gonna ask one last question, sort of based on the conversation we just had here. And this is probably a weedy question, but this is why not now. So the aggregator in these use case examples, in the way that it's being described, are you guys kind of making an assumption of who the aggregator is? In other words, let me ask a different way. Could the EVSE owner be an aggregator in the way that it's been structured here?
Yes, right, because we don't preclude as long as you can actually provide a functionality. So, the way that we define each of the role is by function, right? So if you can provide, and even just the EVSE itself, right? If it actually has functionality built into, or a set of EVSE, that can coordinate together, and that could be an aggregator too, right? So we don't define the role based on like a business role. Aggregator, I get that does have some connotation in the business sense, or in the in the operating sense, but the way that we look at it is purely from the technology standpoint, so that this is an aggregating function, which means that you have more than one EVSE underneath you, right? So if you can coordinate them together, then you become an aggregator, whether you are officially an aggregator or not, right? So even in the directly to the to CSO pathway, you could potentially that could be an aggregator there too, if you can coordinate stuff, right? So, but we want to highlight it, because there are quite a few business now that are providing that function for fleet.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's helpful. I really appreciate that. Okay. So Cuong, thank you so much for the presentation here and joining us today.